The conflict started when I built a fence on my private property, but Karen, the head of the HOA, decided it ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic. She demanded that I tear it down, citing some rules that didn't actually exist. When I refused, she declared war, fines, threats, blackmail, and even illegally shut off my water. But she never expected me to take it all the way to court. I always thought Saturday mornings were made for relaxation. Imagine this. You're sitting on your porch with a cup of strong coffee, enjoying the silence. Sunlight filters through the leaves, a gentle breeze sways the trees, and somewhere in the backyard, my dog. Baxter lazily basks in the warmth. And then, that perfect moment was ruined. "Are you serious?" I would recognize that voice, even in my sleep. I slowly turned my head toward the gate, already knowing what I'd see. There she stood. Karen, the local tyrant disguised as a housewife, the head of the HOA, a woman clearly starved for power, who decided she had the right to dictate how her neighbors lived. If you've never dealt with an HOA, homeowners association, think of them as a mafia run by bored housewives. They decide what color your door can be, how tall your lawn should be, and apparently, who is allowed to breathe in the neighborhood. I took one last calm sip of my coffee and let out a deep breath. "Something wrong, Karen?" She crossed her arms and furrowed her brows. Her perfectly styled blonde bob didn't budge, even as the wind blew, and her expression was as if I had just killed her favorite dog right in front of her. "You built a fence without HOA approval," she practically screeched. I blinked, then slowly looked over at the freshly built fence, still smelling of wood. The straight, smoothly sanded planks, coated with a protective finish, stood tall, finally giving me the privacy I had been wanting. "It's my property, Karen, but it's against the rules," she hissed, pointing at the fence, as if it were a blasphemy. I shrugged. "I read the HOA bylaws. There's nothing in there that says I can't build a fence on my own land." Karen's eyes narrowed, her face turning red. "You don't get it. You're ruining the look of the neighborhood." I smirked. "I'm improving it." Her hands clenched into fists. "I need to inspect your property. Let me in." I slowly placed my mug on the porch railing and looked her dead in the eye. "No, Karen." And that's when I knew. I had just made a huge mistake. Peace in this neighborhood is a relative concept. Just as I was about to take a nap after my lovely morning chat with Karen, a suspicious noise woke me up. At first, I ignored it. I figured it was a squirrel rustling the leaves or the mailman, carelessly tossing my letters again. But then I heard a metallic clank. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. There she was, Karen, standing by my fence with a measuring tape. She was measuring its height. I stood frozen. For a few seconds, trying to process just how ridiculous this scene was. The woman who claimed I had ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic was now meticulously going over every inch of my fence, as if she were trying to find a legal loophole for her revenge. I sighed, rubbed my temples, and stepped outside. "What are you doing?" She didn't even look at me, continuing her measurements as if I didn't exist. "Checking if it complies with HOA standards." I closed my eyes and counted to 3, trying not to say something I'd regret. "You do realize this is trespassing, right?" She finally looked up. "This is not your property. It's community land," she declared, waving the measuring tape like it was a sacred scroll of the law. I blinked. "Karen, step away from my fence." She crossed her arms and stared me down. "Or what?" I pulled my phone out of my pocket. "Or I'm calling the police." Karen scoffed, folding her arms. "Go ahead. Call them." She thought I was bluffing. I wasn't. I dialed 911 and calmly explained the situation. The dispatcher confirmed that trespassing on private property was no joke. 10 minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of my house. As soon as the officer stepped out, Karen instantly switched tactics. Gone was the all-knowing HOA tyrant. Now she was playing the innocent, helpless woman on the verge of tears over the injustices of the world. "Officer, he's violating HOA rules. He built a fence, and he's threatening me." I rolled my eyes. The officer looked at me, then at my fence, then back at me. "Sir, do you have ownership documents for this property?" Without a word, I handed him a copy of the deed that I always kept in the house. The officer glanced over the papers, nodded, and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this is his private property. You have no right to be here without permission." Her eyes went wide. "Are you kidding me? You're taking his side?" The officer let out a tired sigh. "We're on the side of the law, ma'am." Karen gritted her teeth, shooting me a look that could kill. I couldn't help but smile. Her lips trembled, but she quickly spun on her heel and stormed off. But I knew this wasn't over yet. The next morning, when I opened my mailbox, a surprise was waiting for me. An envelope with the HOA logo. I already knew what was inside, but I opened it anyway. Notice of fine, $500 for violating HOA standards. I laughed out loud. Seriously? This was their next move? Apparently, trying to illegally trespass onto my property didn't work, so now they were resorting to more subtle tactics. At that moment, there was a loud knock on the door. 3 sharp, demanding knocks. I took a slow breath, opened the door, and, of course, there stood Karen. She wasn't smiling. No fake pleasantness today, no overacted surprise. Just a hard, determined stare. "I hope you got the notice." I crossed my arms. "You seriously think I'm going to pay?" She stepped closer, almost right up in my face. "You're taking that fence down, or I'll make sure you're removed from this community." I tilted my head slightly, studying her. "And how exactly are you going to do that, Karen?" Her eyes narrowed. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" "Oh, I do. You're a woman who spends her life terrorizing neighbors over mailboxes and house colors. Terrifying." Karen sucked in a breath. That one hit a nerve. "I can make your life a living hell." I smirked. "You're already trying." She blinked, and suddenly, her tone shifted. "Listen." Her voice softened, almost friendly. "Ah, a new tactic. Maybe we can just work something out?" I didn't even pause before answering. "No." A flicker of disappointment crossed her face before it turned into pure irritation. "You just made a huge mistake." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she spun around, storming off. I probably should have been more concerned, but instead, I just shrugged and closed the door. The next day, my water got shut off. Coincidence? I doubt it. It took a lot to make me lose my temper, but when my water got shut off, the next day I knew this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was Karen's personal revenge. She couldn't legally force me to tear down the fence, but she could make my life miserable. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Step 1, official complaint. I went to City Hall and filed a formal complaint. The officials reviewed my documents, my property layout, and in just 10 minutes confirmed my land, private property, my fence, 100% legal. The HOA had no right to demand its removal. But here's the best part. The HOA had absolutely no authority to shut off my water. That was straight up illegal. Step 2, lawyer up. I hired a lawyer, who arranged a meeting with the city's chief administrator and a representative from the utility company. The HOA clearly didn't expect me to take it this far. Step 3. Court. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with a confidence I hadn't felt since moving into this neighborhood. Karen, however, looked different. She sat across from me, arms crossed, lips pressed together. Her eyes held nothing but pure hatred. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The gavel struck the bench. "Let's begin the hearing. Mrs. Baker, explain on what grounds the HOA issued this fine." Karen leaned forward, speaking with the same arrogance she always had. "This man is destroying our neighborhood. His fence ruins the community's aesthetic and violates HOA standards." The judge flipped through the documents. "Mrs. Baker, do you have any legal grounds for this fine?" Karen hesitated. She searched for words, but the judge wasn't letting it slide. "Legally speaking, does he have the right to build this fence?" She blinked. A long pause stretched between us. It damages the overall look of the community." The judge looked up. "I asked a specific question. Do you have legal grounds?" Silence. Step 4. Verdict. The judge let out a sigh and set the papers down. "The HOA is required to dismiss the fine and compensate the plaintiff $500 for emotional distress." Karen's defeat. Karen stiffened. What?" "Case dismissed." The gavel struck the bench. I turned around, smiling openly. Karen sat there, frozen in shock. She couldn't believe she had lost. As I walked out of the courtroom, I could hear her shaky breathing and the grinding of her teeth behind me. The final moment. Back home, I cracked open a cold beer, stepped onto my porch, and leaned back in my chair. A few minutes later, I saw Karen walking down the street. I lifted my bottle and grinned. "Cheers to the new fence." Karen let out a furious growl and quickened her pace. I took a long, satisfied sip. Justice had been served.